Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Hook and Ladder Football Podcast, where I discuss all things NFL related. I am your host, Justice Miranda, and today I'll be discussing the NFL playoffs, more specifically, discussing teams that are in a prime position to get back into the playoffs after missing out last season. The NFL playoffs will be expanding to 14 teams starting this season, which means one more playoff spot will be up for grabs in each conference. With the playoffs expanding, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at some teams who didn't make the playoffs last year and decide which teams are best equipped to make it to the postseason this year. In today's episode, I'll be presenting my case for 4 teams, 2 from each conference, that have the potential to make it to the NFL playoffs. Without further ado, let's jump right into it by getting into the AFC. So, first team in the AFC is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Pittsburgh finished the season with an 8-8 record and just missed out on the playoffs last season. Pittsburgh was a good quarterback away from making the playoffs, but obviously their quarterback room was a mess when Ben Roethlisberger went down with a season-ending elbow injury. The Steelers had to rely on the likes of Mason Rudolph and Devlin Duck Hodges at quarterback to help keep the offense afloat, but they were unable to do so. Pittsburgh was basically carried by their defense, which ranked out as one of the best in the league last year. And even with an outstanding defense, Pittsburgh's lack of quarterback depth really showed that you need a competent quarterback to still win games in the NFL and still make the playoffs. The good thing for the Steelers, however, is that Ben Roethlisberger will be returning this season, which is key if Pittsburgh wants to make the playoffs. With the return of Big Ben, the offense will get a nice boost and they will be more efficient than the group last year, which ranked as the 3rd lowest in the league in total yards of offense per game. And although Pittsburgh has a solid set of pass catchers in Juju Smith-Schuster, James Washington, and Deontay Johnson, they went out and grabbed some more talent by signing tight end Eric Ebron to a 2-year deal and drafting wide receiver Chase Claypool out of Notre Dame in the 2nd round of the NFL draft. With the additions of big-bodied guys like Ebron and Claypool, it just gives Roethlisberger another great option on the offense to utilize. As for running back, it seems Pittsburgh will ride James Conner as their lead back this season, but they did draft a speedster in Anthony McFarland Jr. in the 4th round out of Maryland as insurance just in case Conner does go down with an injury like he did many times last year. And if Conner ends up going down to injury again this year, Pittsburgh may struggle at the running back position unless McFarland somehow steps up, but personally, I don't really see that happening. As for the offensive line, Pittsburgh will be returning most of their players from the line, except guard Ramon Foster, who did retire earlier this offseason. But even with the retirement and a weaker offensive line than usual, Pittsburgh still has an offensive line with 2 Pro Bowlers in David DeCastro and Marquise Pouncey, so they should still do a nice job at protecting Roethlisberger in the upcoming season. With the offense set to make a splash this season, the defense should be doing the same thing as well because they are bringing back nearly every single starter from a year ago. Pittsburgh's defense ranked as one of the best defenses in the league last year, as they allowed the 3rd fewest passing yards per game at 194.6, and only allowed 304.1 yards of total offense per game, which was the 5th best in the league. And Pittsburgh's front 7 is pretty stacked. On the defensive line, you have 2-time Pro Bowl defensive end Cam Hayward, who leads the charge along Stephon Tuitt, and they make for a very formidable duo. The linebacker core is solid as well, with guys like 2-time Pro Bowler TJ Watt, who has logged 27.5 sacks in the past 2 seasons, which is just ridiculous. They also got 2nd-year linebacker Devin Bush, who is coming off an impressive rookie campaign, and linebacker Bud Dupree, who had a breakout 2019 season where he recorded 11.5 sacks. The secondary is also filled with talented players like cornerback Joe Hayden, who is coming off a Pro Bowl season, and young safety Minkah Fitzpatrick, who put the defense on another level once he was traded from Miami to Pittsburgh earlier in the season, and it led to a Pro Bowl appearance, and deservingly so. But besides Pro Bowlers Joe Hayden and Minkah Fitzpatrick, they have some nice pieces in cornerback Steven Nelson and a young but growing safety in Terrell Edmonds. Overall, Pittsburgh is entering the season with a defense that nearly carried the team to the playoffs with terrible quarterback play. Now just imagine that stiff defense with Big Ben and a much improved offense. It's a completely different and much better team, and I expect them to be one of the better teams in the AFC this coming season. Now moving on to the next team in the AFC that could make a return to the playoffs, and I was deciding between a few different teams here, but I ended up going with the Indianapolis Colts. Last season, the Colts finished 7-9, mainly because of inconsistent quarterback play from Jacoby Brissett. In general, the offense just did not function as smoothly as it did the year before when they made the playoffs, but obviously a large part of that is attributed to the fact that Andrew Luck retired before the season started, and they were definitely a worse team without him last year. but I like Indy to make a return to the playoffs this year. So let's start on the offense. On the offense, obviously the signing of Philip Rivers was the biggest offseason decision by the Colts, no question about it. Now, you can say Rivers is washed and definitely not as talented as he used to be, which I understand, but he's still a solid quarterback and he has plenty of experience and he is a better option than Jacoby Brissett. And really, there's no reason for Rivers to worry about the offensive line either because Indy has had one of the best offensive lines over the past couple of seasons. So Rivers should have a lot of time to work with while in the pocket. Although Indy seems to have their short-term quarterback fix, the offense in general was still lacking talent, especially at wide receiver. T.Y. Hilton is always the go-to guy, but he only played 10 games last season, and his absence put Indy's poor wide receiver core on display. I mean, Zach Pascal ended the season as the team's leading receiver with 600 yards, but Indy should fare better this season because they drafted wide receiver Michael Pittman Jr. out of USC in the second round to help complement T.Y. Hilton in the offense. Pittman stands at 6'4", 223 pounds, and he has been compared to wide receiver Vincent Jackson, who, just in case you didn't know, played with Philip Rivers and was actually one of his favorite targets to throw to while in San Diego. Indy also drafted one of the best running backs in the draft, Jonathan Taylor out of Wisconsin, in the second round to complement Marlon Mack in the backfield. Mack was, in my opinion, a solid running back, but adding Taylor will make the offense more dynamic moving forward. And I do expect the Colts to use a running back by committee approach with the two backs. So now that we've discussed the offense, let's move on to the defense. Indy actually has a nice front seven, and they are good at stopping the run. And they put it on display last year after allowing the seventh fewest rushing yards per game. Indy ended up losing key contributor defensive end Jabal Sheard in free agency, but they did trade away their first round pick to the 49ers for defensive tackle DeForest Buckner. Personally, I like the move as it provides Indianapolis's interior defensive line with a great player and just more help at the position in general. And Indy is also bringing back veteran defensive end Justin Houston, who made a big impact last year by getting after the quarterback and logging 11 sacks in his first season with Indianapolis. At linebacker, Darius Leonard is the guy as he's fresh off a Pro Bowl season where he finished with 121 tackles and 5 interceptions. Leonard is one of the best defensive players on this roster, and I expect him to have another Pro Bowl caliber season. Indy, they could use a bit more help at the position, I think, the linebacker position, but they're still a solid group. In the secondary, their secondary was average, I would say, last season, but they need to get better if they want to compete with the big boys. Secondary has undergone a few changes, though, in the offseason, most notably the departure of cornerback Pierre Desir and the signings of cornerbacks TJ Carey and Xavier Rhodes. Overall, the defense should be a bit more improved from last season because of the additions at cornerback. The Colts have a real shot at cracking the playoffs this year because they have a better quarterback in Philip Rivers, a better receiving core with T.Y. Hilton and now Michael Pittman, a better tandem of running backs with Marlon Mack and Jonathan Taylor, and just a better secondary with T.J. Carey and Xavier Rhodes. I would not be shocked at all to see Indy playing in the postseason next year. So that does it for the AFC portion of this podcast. Now let's move on to the NFC. And in the NFC, the Dallas Cowboys, for me, are the most likely NFC team to make the playoffs after missing them last season. Last season, the Cowboys finished 8-8 and finished second in the NFC East. It was an up and down season for Dallas, really, as they started 3-0, but then finished the year losing 4 of their last 6 games, including a Week 16 loss to the Philadelphia Eagles, which virtually knocked them out of the playoffs. So there are a lot of reasons why I like Dallas this year to make the playoffs, but we'll start on the offense. Obviously, Dak Prescott hasn't received the long-term deal that he's been desiring for the past year, as he was franchise tagged, and he'll likely end up playing the rest of the season under the franchise tag. Because of this, I think he'll ball out again this year because he'll be trying to prove something. Also, as we're about to discuss, he has a lot of offensive weapons now. Dallas should be able to have one of the most productive offenses in the NFL, especially with guys like Zeke Elliott, Amari Cooper, who just signed a 5-year, $100 million deal, Michael Gallup, and now CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver CeeDee Lamb, who they drafted 17th overall, who honestly they shouldn't even have gotten. They got lucky that he slid that far. I personally think he's the best wide receiver in the draft. So that's a steal for Dallas. They have the talent. But, it also helps when you have one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. Now, moving on to the defensive side, Dallas' starting defensive line should look different next season as DeMarcus Lawrence is expected to be the only returning starter on the defensive line. The biggest loss was by far Robert Quinn, who had 11.5 sacks while with Dallas last season. But Dallas did good in the offseason by finding solid replacements for those who departed. They've added veteran Gerald McCoy, who personally I don't think is as good as Robert Quinn, but he has finished his past 8 seasons with 5 or more sacks, so that's always a good thing. Another veteran, Dontari Poe, was signed. Poe has underachieved past couple of seasons, but he's still a nice piece to add to the defensive line. Dallas is pretty solid at linebacker, and the combination of rising stars Leighton Vander Esch and Jalen Smith will make it difficult on opposing offenses to function. Vander Esch only played 9 games last season because of a neck injury, but he was a Pro Bowler the season before. As for Jalen Smith, he is coming off a breakout season where he logged a team-high 142 tackles and was selected to his first ever Pro Bowl for Dallas. Dallas ranked 10th in the league in passing yards allowed per game last season, and I think they can establish a feat similar to that this season with their secondary. The two major changes in the secondary were the loss of cornerback Byron Jones and the addition of Clinton Dix at safety. Losing Byron Jones is big, but Dallas selected cornerback Trayvon Diggs, the brother of Stephon Diggs, out of Alabama in the second round, and I could see a path where he eventually fills Byron Jones' spot later in the season. As for safety, Clinton Dix had a solid season last year, and he'll be a nice complementary piece to the other safety, Xavier Woods, in the secondary. Overall, Dallas' offense is stacked, and they've added some nice pieces to the defense, so I expect Dallas to make the playoffs this year. Now, moving on to the final team that will be discussed in this episode. I was struggling. I had a difficult time choosing between two different teams, the Bucs and the Cardinals, for this spot, but ultimately I chose Tampa Bay. So, last season, Tampa Bay finished 7-9 thanks to the inconsistent play of Jameis Winston, who became the first quarterback to ever throw 30 touchdowns and 30 interceptions in a single season. Tampa Bay seemed to have enough of Winston because they let him walk and instead decided to make the biggest offseason acquisition by signing Tom Brady to a 2-year, $50 million deal. And then soon after that, Brady got an old pal, tight end Rob Gronkowski, to sign with the Bucs. So let's first discuss why the offense will be a large part of Tampa's success this season. Having a future Hall of Fame quarterback like Tom Brady on your team is an immense upgrade from the inconsistent Jameis Winston. And Tom Brady will definitely benefit from having something that he didn't have last year, offensive weapons. He's now got guys like Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Rob Gronkowski, and O.J. Howard. The only concern for Tampa Bay is how much protection the O-line will be able to give for Brady, but they eased some of that concern by taking offensive tackle Tristan Wirfs with the 13th overall pick in the draft. Obviously, I really like Tampa's odds at a postseason return because of the offense they will have, but I think their defense will be a significant reason for their success this season as well, because they have one of the best front sevens in the NFL. Tampa Bay was actually the stiffest team against the run last year as they ranked first in the league in rushing yards allowed per game, and they only allowed 73.8 rushing yards per game last season, which is just ridiculous. And the best part for Tampa is that they're returning nearly every single player from last season's front seven. Just let me list some of the talent they have. On the defensive line, they have veteran Ndamukong Suh, Vita Vea, and Jason Pierre-Paul, who has recorded 21 sacks in his first 2 seasons with Tampa Bay. At the linebacker position, which is where I think Tampa Bay is the most deadly on defense, they have Devin White, who's coming off an impressive rookie campaign, Levante David, who led the team with 123 tackles last year, and 2019 Pro Bowler Shaquille Barrett, who led the NFL with 19.5 sacks last season. Even though Tampa has a spectacular front seven, their secondary is what has let them down in the past. While Tampa Bay gave up the fewest rushing yards per game last season, they gave up the 3rd most passing yards per game. And it just serves as a reminder that their secondary is in desperate need for help. Overall, I like Tampa Bay's chances of getting back to the postseason for the first time since 2007. The offense should thrive with newly acquired Tom Brady, Rob Gronkowski, and Tristan Wirfs. The front seven on the defense is no joke, and they'll continue to dominate. The only thing holding Tampa Bay back at this point is their secondary. Well, that'll just about do it for this episode of the Hook and Ladder Football Podcast. Thank you all for tuning in and listening to this discussion about the upcoming NFL season and the possible playoff contenders for 2020-2021. Once again, thank you, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Take care.